there is no quick fix for burnout. Burnout took long for it to occur. The recovery is going to take long. People often think it's just rest, a little bit of self-care, a pamper here and there.
Because of the mental and emotional consequences of burnout, often people make poorer health choices. Chronic stress has been shown to cause desensitization of serotonin receptors, and that might explain why there is sometimes an overlap between burnout and syndromes like depression.
Boundaries. Whatever's depleting your resources, whatever you feel is outweighing your capacity, what is okay for me and what is not okay for me.
Welcome to smulcast, where we help you live a healthier, fuller life. We are still discussing burnout. If you joined for our previous episode, we talked about what burnout is and what some of the risk factors are for burnout. Today, we're joined again by Dr. Ange Nespola, and we're going to be chatting about resilience factors, underlying mechanisms, and ways that we can prevent and manage burnout. Dr. Ange, it's so wonderful to have you here again with us.
Thank you. It's good to be back. I wanted to start by asking you a question. We often think about burnout in terms of the psychological implications and the mental health implications. Can you talk us through the physical symptoms associated with burnout?
Absolutely. So you mentioned some of these in the previous episode in one of the stages. And I'm going to be chatting about this from a general practitioner perspective. GPs are often first-line responders, as it were, to burnout. And when I chat about some of the research around this, I just want to give upfront a disclaimer, because there actually isn't a full understanding of the mechanisms behind burnout in terms of biology. And that's because of a few things. First of all, there's a lot of variability in study populations. A lot of the research that has been done is cross-sectional, so it's quite difficult to interpret causality. And then thirdly, there isn't any standard measurement for burnout. And especially when we're talking about biomarkers, it's quite difficult to underpin what is going on when we're talking about the biological consequences of burnout. I also think it might be quite helpful to give our listeners a framework to think about as we discuss this. So, as a listener, visualize this in your mind with me. Think about 4 concentric circles, and that 4th circle is the furthest away from an individual. In this outer circle, we are thinking about someone's context. So this is their actual working environment, maybe their family or relationships, their socioeconomic influences, etc. The next circle in is their environment and their behavioral choices. So the food choices someone is making, what exercise they are doing or not doing. If they're sleeping, are they seeking support? Are they connecting socially? Are they engaging in substance use? The next circle is somebody's physical body and the various systems that are involved. And when we're talking about burnout and chronic stress, the primary ones that are implicated there are the immune, neurological, cardiovascular systems. And those we'll be chatting about some of the underlying mechanisms about. And then lastly, the final circle is what is happening at a cellular level. And this is where we're looking at something like epigenetics, how the environment is interacting with the expression of our genes, and as well how chronic stress and burnout might be affecting our cells and mitochondrial health. So because of the wide-ranging effects of the stress response in our system, there are also a wide range of physical symptoms that can present. And I like to think about them in terms of slightly shorter term or more immediate symptoms, and then chronic longer term consequences. So looking at the symptoms, the first one is fatigue. That's obviously inherent to the phenomenon of burnout. Fatigue is a lack of energy or a sense of tiredness that impacts your daily function and or doesn't respond to appropriate rest. The second thing is insomnia. There's a correlation between burnout and sleep disorders, where sleep is more fragmented, there's less REM sleep, and you can listen to any of the other smulcast episodes to know how important sleep is for your overall health. Individuals might experience more musculoskeletal pain and headaches. There can be increased frequency of infections like colds and flu. Sometimes there's a correlation with gastrointestinal symptoms, usually similar to IBS. And then, of course, because of the mental and emotional complications or consequences of burnout, often people make poorer health choices. So often people find themselves eating more. There is a subset of people that might eat less, but generally speaking, people eat more. And they also gravitate to foods that are higher in fat, salt, and sugar. People tend to exercise less, probably because they are fatigued. And people then can engage in substance use, so using alcohol and smoking to try and self-medicate. If we look at the longer term consequences, these are things that someone might not actually feel, right? But they are a combination of both the mechanisms behind burnout, so the chronic stress element, as well as the health behaviors that are associated with burnout. So there is a correlation between burnout and cardiovascular and cardiometabolic disease. So high blood pressure, increased cholesterol, obesity, insulin resistance, and type 2 diabetes. And then there is also an increased risk of mental health conditions like anxiety and depression.
I think that's so important because very often clients who walk into therapy have been referred by a general practitioner for those reasons. Those physical aspects come up first. Can you talk us through the underlying mechanisms that could cause these symptoms?
Absolutely. So I'm going to touch on 5 primary things that come up in the literature. When we look at the first one, it's cortisol, and that, as we have discussed, is inherent to burnout. Cortisol is quite difficult to assess in that there is variation from day to night and within a day, and there are different ways to measure it. But what the literature does seem to show is that often people present with a low cortisol picture and a blunted cortisol awakening response, which is the normal rise in cortisol in the morning that's responsible for that feeling of get up and go, start your day. But there are studies that also show higher levels of cortisol, and that's usually what people would think when we think of stress is higher levels of cortisol. But in fact, we see this complex relationship where at times it might be low, at other times it might be high. And part of the reason that it might be low, one hypothesis at least, is that there are detrimental effects of elevated cortisol on the brain. And so there might be a protective downregulation of cortisol production in an attempt to not have these continuously elevated levels of cortisol. The next one is inflammation. We know that burnout and chronic stress causes changes in immune function, and one of those changes is an elevation in inflammatory markers. This is not unique to burnout. This is seen in other conditions like depression, for example. But we also know that higher inflammation levels, or chronic inflammation at least, can predispose an individual to cardiovascular disease. So there's a really important interplay between the actual syndrome of burnout and then some of the longer term health consequences involving this inflammation. To talk a little bit more about cardiovascular disease, I've mentioned that there is this increased risk and this correlation with a variety of different cardiometabolic disorders. And the thinking here is that we have this increased reactivity of our stress response system, so our autonomic system and our HPA axis, that is causing the cardiovascular system to go into overdrive, having elevated blood pressure and elevated heart rate. That might be one explanation for why we see this increased rise in cardiometabolic disorders. Another that is quite interesting, especially for listeners that might have wearable devices, is something called heart rate variability. And this is a measure of the variation between your heartbeats. And interestingly, it gives us an indication of how flexible your autonomic nervous system is and how well you are able to adapt to and recover from stress. So there is literature looking at states of chronic stress and that being correlated with a lower HRV. Higher HRV is correlated with a better adaptability to stress. It's important to recognize that heart rate variability, or at least a low heart rate variability, is also not unique to burnout and exists in other states. And there are other influences that play a role, like age, fitness level, and quality and quantity of sleep. So chronic stress is a significant contributor to oxidative stress, which is just an imbalance between free radical formation, which are damaging in our body, and antioxidant production, which are our defenses. When there is increased oxidative stress, this can be damaging to our mitochondria. And when there is mitochondrial dysfunction, that can impact our energy production and might explain some of the underlying mechanism of why we see exhaustion and cognitive deficits. There may also be a bidirectional relationship here between energy production and the symptoms of burnout, and vice versa, our stress resilience being impacted by what is happening at a cellular level. And then lastly, the cognitive impacts of all of this. Stress, both acute and chronic, has an impact on the brain both structurally and functionally. So we've mentioned the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation, emotional regulation, and learning, and the amygdala, which is involved in fear processing. There's also the prefrontal cortex, which is our executive functioning site in our brain and is really important for attention and focus. When we experience chronic stress, the hippocampus actually atrophies, which is another word for shrinks, and there is reduced neurogenesis, so a reduced formation of new neurons in these brain regions. And that might explain why the literature does show decreases in executive function, memory, and focus capabilities in individuals that are chronically stressed and burnt out. There is also this relationship between cortisol and our cognitive function that forms an inverted U shape. So we actually do need the right amount of cortisol to enhance our cognitive function. Too low cortisol and too high cortisol can be detrimental for our cognitive performance. And then, of course, there are our neurotransmitters. So these are signaling molecules produced by neurons to carry out different actions. Most people would have heard of things like serotonin and dopamine. So chronic stress can impact both neurotransmitter levels and production and their receptor sensitivity. Chronic stress has been shown to cause desensitization of serotonin receptors, and that might explain why there is sometimes an overlap between burnout and syndromes like depression. If we use an example of a normal response to stress, when we're stressed, one of the neurotransmitters that gets released is glutamate, and this is an excitatory neurotransmitter. When that is released, other parts of the brain release GABA, which is a calming or inhibitory neurotransmitter. And the idea is that it helps to regulate the fear response that gets processed by the amygdala. But when we're experiencing chronic stress, as in burnout, we have elevated levels of glutamate and cortisol over a prolonged period of time, and there's a disruption of this inhibitory or calming effect and even reduced levels of GABA, and that can lead to the amygdala being hyperreactive and contributing to symptoms like anxiety, depression, and some of the cognitive dysfunction elements that we see.
That makes so much sense, because I think what I often see is a difficulty in clients regulating emotion, and that comes with the burnout. And that relates to the cortisol levels that you spoke us through. The other thing I want to touch on is the dopamine levels and the dysregulation of that neurotransmitter. And it makes sense that it leads to difficulty engaging in activities in everyday life, because that affects one's sense of reward. And they won't engage in things that they usually enjoy if that system is dysregulated. Mm-hmm. So I think that's super important. And also touching on the serotonin and the mood and showing us how it links to the physical aspects of one's health, how deep burnout can run. I think people often think it's just rest, a little bit of self-care, a pamper here and there, but it runs so much deeper than that.
Mm. Absolutely, and I'm so excited to get to this next part of the conversation. But just to summarize what we've chatted about, because we've discussed quite a few different things, there are really these 5 key underpinnings that the literature seems to show, in that burnout and chronic stress impacts cortisol, our immune function, cardiovascular health, mitochondrial function, and then of course what's happening at a brain level, both cognitively and at a neurotransmitter level. Let's chat about something I think is so integral to this whole discussion, and that is resilience. How can we foster resilience? What can we do to incorporate practices that bolster our resilience and hopefully prevent us from developing burnout?
The first thing is supportive relationships. Be that in your personal life or in your work environment with colleagues, with management. That is a massive protective factor in burnout. The literature, time and time again, points to that and reinforces that. The next thing is work-life balance. This is important for, I think, all aspects of health, but particularly with burnout. Taking stock. What is your work-life balance like? What do you do after hours? Do you still have your phone with your emails? Are you still thinking about it? What does that balance look like in your life? I often think about it as, one's life in terms of a sphere. And there are different aspects of the sphere. You've got your personal life, your work life, your health, your spiritual life. What does balance look like for you? Because your balance might not look like my balance, but is there some sense of balance in these areas of your life? Is there a work-life balance and a balance between these aspects of your life? So really doing some reflection is really important. And then I wouldn't be a psychologist if I don't mention boundaries. Boundaries. In your work life, it could be with family members, whatever's depleting your resources, whatever you feel is outweighing your capacity to consider boundaries is really important. And boundaries shift. A boundary is really what is okay for me and what is not okay for me. That can change. Your capacity might shift from now to next month to next year. But being aware of that awareness is key in resilience.
There's a beautiful quote by Prentice Hemphill that says, "A boundary is the distance at which I love you and me simultaneously." And I think it really highlights exactly what you are talking about. So
absolutely.
Thank you for sharing those really important points. I don't think that they can be overstated.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. I love that. The other one I want to touch on is emotion regulation. Finding ways to regulate your emotions. Firstly, identifying your emotions. And I touched on the importance earlier, because what happens if we don't connect to our emotions is we suppress them. We have unhealthy coping mechanisms and they come out sideways at some point. They've got to go somewhere. They bubble up. So emotion regulation is really important in mental health, in emotional well-being, but also in burnout, because you then recognize your needs as well. You're able to respond to your needs, to put boundaries in place, to put self-care practices in place. So that's also another one that I think is really important in terms of resilience. So there are various aspects that can lend itself to resilience to prevent burnout that are sustainable in life. Could you talk us through the physical ways to prevent burnout and increase resilience?
First of all, I just want to say that some of the symptoms, or at least actually a lot of these symptoms, overlap with other medical and mental health conditions. For example, fatigue. There's many possible underlying causes and explanations for fatigue. And so it is really essential to be working with a healthcare provider and potentially a team of healthcare providers to investigate that appropriately and address it. The tools that I'm going to share are mostly around modulating the autonomic nervous system response to stress. But before I go there, I can't, again, understate the pillars that you've already touched on. Those are foundational. They really are fundamental in terms of both preventing burnouts, but also as a really important arm of recovery. And those are obviously really good quality and quantity of sleep, good and adequate nutrition, and a healthy relationship with food, and then the social connection that you mentioned as well. So the big one that I'm going to talk about is exercise. I don't think the discussion would be complete without it. Exercise is really interesting in that it actually increases parasympathetic activity and helps us to cope with the two arms of the autonomic nervous system a little bit better. During a bout of exercise, our sympathetic nervous system does kick into gear and we will experience a form of stress. But what happens after exercise is that there is this rebound increase in parasympathetic activity. And what is really important is that with consistent exercise, we get to have the benefit of this increased parasympathetic activity. The literature shows, with regards to consistency, that higher exercise frequency correlates with reduced feelings of burnout, and some studies show that there's a minimum of about 3 times per week to see benefit. But I also just want to emphasize that every little bit counts, and to be absolutist and think in terms of all or nothing thinking is not really helpful here. And really any form of exercise is going to bring benefits, so don't let that hold you back. If we then look at the different types of exercise, there are, as I said, all forms have benefit, but there are some unique benefits to certain types of exercise when we're looking at chronic stress. The first one I'm going to mention is aerobic exercise. So this is things like running and cycling, for example. There seems to be a greater increase in parasympathetic activity than resistance training when we are talking about aerobic training. There is a randomized control trial showing that aerobic training improves memory and cognitive function in individuals that were experiencing stress-related exhaustion. So there clearly is a benefit here. And then high intensity interval training, or HIIT, also has unique benefits in that it can help with mitochondrial function and repair, where lactate acts as a signaling molecule for the formation of new mitochondria. So that's quite a unique benefit for that form of exercise. When we look at resistance training, it seems that that helps with psychological resilience, as well as being able to better cope with stress. And then, of course, there are practices that are more mind-body based, like Tai Chi and yoga, that incorporate both movement and a sense of mindfulness, and that has been shown to increase parasympathetic activity. So in terms of timing, both pre-work and post-work exercise are beneficial, but it seems that there might be a little bit of an edge to pre-work or morning exercise in that it helps to bolster the cortisol response in the morning and sets a positive tone for the day. But also exercise after work might help with decompressing and transitioning from a stressful work day to home. And then a piece that I'm really passionate about is exercise during your workday. And there is an actual term for this, it's not my doing, of an exercise snack. And that is 1 to 2 minutes of vigorous intensity exercise done 3 to 8 times during the day. There was a study that looked at over 25,000 participants using wearables over a 6-year period. And they found that individuals doing an exercise snack, so just 1 to 2 minutes, 3 times a day, had a reduction in cardiovascular mortality by 49% compared to non-exercisers. So that's really, really significant. And there really is no excuse to not stop 3 times a day to do 1 to 2 minutes of exercise. We also know that short bouts of exercise around mealtime, so either pre-meal or post-meal by about 30 minutes, improves glucose homeostasis and allows glucose to enter our muscles, and that might be one way to offset some of the cardiometabolic effects of stress, but also improve your health, because a lot of us are sitting throughout our workday, and that can be something as simple as 10 bodyweight squats. You don't necessarily have to go for a 30-minute walk to achieve that benefit. The next one is this concept of cross-adaptation. And cross-adaptation is this idea that if you expose yourself to a stressor in a controlled and safe way and teach yourself to manage the symptoms and the effects of adrenaline by calming yourself through your thoughts, but also your breath, that can translate into benefits in other stressful situations. There was a study that looked at individuals who did cold water immersion and were then exposed to exercise in a hypoxic environment, so similar to exercising at high altitude, which is also a stressor. And they found that the group that had done the cold water immersions compared to the group that didn't had a greater parasympathetic response when they were doing the hypoxic exercise. So it's just a demonstration of how this might look, but it doesn't necessarily have to be cold water immersion. And then the last one that I want to touch on, which is maybe a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more difficult in terms of practical application, is this idea of cognitive reappraisal. And that is how we perceive a stressor. And the analogy that I'm going to steal from Dr. Alyssa Eppel is the lion and the gazelle. Both are experiencing a stress response. They both have an increased sympathetic drive, but the lion is excited and thinking, I might get dinner, whereas the gazelle, on the other hand, is stressed and worrying about dying. So it's a very different experience between the two of them. And what the literature seems to show is that because of the perception that you have of your stress, it can actually improve your cardiovascular response to stress and even your recovery with regard to stress. So I think that's a really interesting point. There's a lot of different tools one can use to do this, and a lot of them are psychological. The one that I'm going to reference again from Dr. Alyssa Epel is this idea of distancing. So being able to have the perspective on the stressor and say to yourself, for example, this isn't going to matter in 10 years' time, right? That might not necessarily be the case, but the concept remains that if you can distance yourself from a stressor and put it in its right place, that might be able to help you reframe it as a challenge rather than this really big, awful stressor.
I think this is so important because often when I'm working with a client who is burnt out, we do need to take a multidisciplinary approach with other practitioners. And everything you've said highlights that. I think when somebody walks into my office next with burnout, I want them to watch this podcast first. It's so informative and so important to see the aspects that integrate. And it's more complex than people think and that people realize from the beginning.
Yeah, it really is. I think the effects and the mechanisms are so broad for burnout, but that's why it's really important to have these discussions.
Yes.
And as you said, involve a multidisciplinary team. And off the back of that, if we think about recovery, we know that recovery is a long-term process, and at least in what the research shows, it usually takes months, if not years, to recover from burnout. Can you walk us through what an effective recovery plan could look like for someone?
I want to highlight what you said there. It's a long-term process. I think that expectation is important. It's not there is no quick fix for burnout. Burnout took long for it to occur. The recovery is going to take long. When you present for treatment from a psychological perspective, we want to understand the cause. And that's where we will do a history intake, a full history intake. And that can take a session, 2 sessions, possibly even 3, to understand what were the stresses for you. What were the demands that exceeded the resources, that exceeded your capacity? So we want to understand that, we want to unpack that. And then exploring what needs to shift. I spoke about work-life balance. We'll think about that. We'll think around what needs to change, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. You might be able to stop a burnout episode now, but if you don't put structures in place to prevent it, to make it more sustainable, you're going to repeat the process. And I often find that once somebody has burnt out, they're more susceptible to burnout. And I think it relates to a lot of aspects that you touched on. So to make it sustainable, we need to look at the work-life balance. We then also want to look at tools that might be useful for somebody. And you touched on some of them. Other things I might recommend is mindfulness. Mindfulness is absolutely everything in terms of mental health. And I think some people are afraid of it or shy away from it if they don't understand it or they haven't tried it. Mindfulness can look different for different people. Some people want to do a guided meditation. Other people want to do a more traditional meditation, an active meditation. Whatever it might be for you, mindfulness is bringing yourself to the here and now. And if you think about everything that we spoke about in terms of burnout, you can see how that could be an aspect that's really important in recovery, is being able to connect to the here and now, because you then connect to your emotions, you connect to your capacity, you're aware of your capacity, you're aware of your boundaries. There's just so many aspects that relate to that. Breathing, breath work. I think people go through their day, they go through the busyness of every day. Very seldom do we actually just stop to breathe. And, you know, we spoke about the body, and sending oxygen to the body is so important. And that can also be a technique that people can employ alongside everything else that they'll be working on.
I think that's so key. It's alongside everything else. Yes. There isn't one thing that is going to fix this. And as you say, it's potentially going to take quite a long period of time. And that is ensuring proper recovery.
Absolutely.
From burnout. I also just want to add as well that probably the first step is not just identifying some of these symptoms, but then reaching out for help. That's really key, so that you have someone to do this alongside you. You know, today with so much information being available, it's really easy to self-diagnose, but it really is important to have someone actually unpack this with you and take you through the recovery process as well.
Absolutely. And depending on your symptoms, we spoke about how it presents differently for different people.
Exactly.
Some people, if they've got gut issues that present, we might refer them to a dietitian. So bringing on the correct practitioners also relates to that, and why it's so important to reach out for help so we can make sense of what's happening for you, because everyone's experience is so different.
Thank you so much, Dr. Angie, for sharing your insights and your knowledge on this topic. I'm sure it's been really beneficial to a lot of our listeners, and I think a lot of people have probably identified some of these things for themselves. For our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope that you've gained some really valuable knowledge and understanding of what burnout is, how to prevent it, and ways that you can effectively manage it. Until next time, keep living a healthier and fuller life.